Afternoon, morning.
Evening, whatever.
Yeah, right. It's 7 p.m.
Yeah, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I saw your day 31.
Hmm?
Bit of a risky one, that, isn't it?
I didn't name any names.
But they know her names already, don't they?
They know who they are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what are they going to do? Not give me a reference?
So, yeah, yeah. That's the other odd one. In all of mine, I've never bothered to ask for a reference,
Mm-hmm.
but I've never not got one.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. Hey, Mark.
And my Mark, and with things like LinkedIn and people that you know rather than the direct employer, it all sort of goes by the wayside.
Yeah,
Plus,
yeah.
plus,
I mean, I
almost
may regret it. Mark, Tim was just saying that my post today was maybe a little too direct.
brave.
But I guess maybe part of what's going on in my head, and maybe I will live to regret this, but at the moment, I'm not really kind of focused on trying to replace the job that I have now with another similar job, another assistant professor on a tenure track at a college or university kind of a thing. If if that changes and I do end up wanting that job and this, kind of makes it more difficult for me, then maybe I will regret this direction. But I do think that it is, I mean, it sort of is, and this, I think I talked about the previous day.
Was it yesterday?
It's incumbent on people like me to say something now, because history is going to roll on. In a couple of years, people are not going to have this perspective, and they're not going to remember this unless somebody kind of says it now.
Well, that was the thing that I must admit I really did like, was this is the as we go through the process contemporaneous notes.
Yeah.
This is not quite Caesar writing as he vanquishes Gaul, but not. Oh, as I say, brave. As I say, brave.
I do think that that it is sort of incumbent on me to say some things that and not precisely because other people are going to wish that they wouldn't be said, but I don't know. It's I don't know, to connect that with what we're reading this week. I did, however, think that when in the high cost of the free market chapter, they, Orestes and Conway get to the point where they're sort of relitigating COVID and that stuff. Yeah. That it was, I did kind of consider that a little bit of a letdown, especially because it was very. And maybe partially, and so maybe it's not like that, because maybe partially what I sort of objected to in that passage of that chapter was that they were sort of rewriting the truth, the record as well, in a way that that I thought was not that helpful.
Well, right? I was trying to figure out when during the whole course of things they actually were writing that. I mean, were they still kind of in COVID? Because the delay between publication and writing can be, I don't know, 6 months, 9 months, a year.
Right. I would imagine that probably it was a sort of a late addition to something that was already in production.
Yeah. Right.
Like, hey, and in order to make it as relevant as possible. I thought it was.
What didn't you like? I mean, I thought it was interesting in that they did a couple of things with costs that I thought was interesting. One was the true cost of the COVID experience, maybe criticizing, I assume, criticizing the Trump administration for their slow reaction, which meant that the U.S. suffered greater costs than other countries under comparable, in theory, comparable circumstances. They did another thing related, the banking bailouts, I think, and trying to understand the true cost of these decisions it's almost like if you want to take the business perspective, what are the costs of some of these lack of government interventions? Because it's kind of another version of the neighborhood effect when we all end up paying for a lot of these things, but someone else doesn't have to incur that, even though they were the decision makers or something to that effect.
Yeah, or even things like your local, if you have a homeowners association and they want to up the fee $10 a month, and everybody votes it down because they don't realize inflation and costs go up, and then instead of fixing something horribly bad goes wrong. I'm thinking maybe something like in a governmental space, 2008 and the crisis and the crash. And then the cost of fixing the thing is 10 times more than having done it up front.
Well, they do another version of that thing, the same thing. I just thought of that, of kind of the climate change or the lack of, government or efforts to mitigate or reduce or curtail or hold constant, and which is kind of ironic now, thinking of the costs that are going to come from Hawaii and and Florida.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. I listened this, I guess it was yesterday. I was somehow it came up in my podcast feed. It was older. It was from like 2020, but it was a conversation between Brett Weinstein and Eric Weinstein. And Brett is the biologist, evolutionary biologist, and Eric is the mathematician who's dabbling in that point where physics and higher math kind of converges. And it was really, it was interesting because it was, these brothers who have known each other all their lives talking to each other about stuff. But it was also kind of interesting because both of them are people who, were involved in these controversies and were not believed. And they said something at one point. They said something about the 2008 about when the first investment bank failed. Which one was that? That was not Lehman Brothers. That was the other one, right? Bear Stearns, or vice versa. Right? Maybe Lehman was the first one. But the point that they were making was the first one happens and everybody thinks, those guys are a bunch of losers. The hell with them. We're not worried about that. And then later, then the next one fails and AIG is, in imminent danger and stuff.
But that's where the film Margin Call does so well, because they don't actually name which bank. Mm-hmm. All you see is what's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah. I've got that on my list of things that I haven't seen it yet, but I need to.
The skill in doing that dialogue to give a such a detailed story with all the technicalities that go with it, and to make it explainable, but without actually really pointing blame in any one direction, and without actually making either the man in the street, the banker, or the system much other than there's no mention of the government.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because, because then you have to sort of ask yourself, and I think this was the point that they were making, and I don't think that they resolved it. This was, like I said, this was a 2020 thing. So it was, COVID was still ongoing. I thought it was interesting that they, there's speculations, on the record about Wuhan and the lab and, all of that were kind of prescient. But in any case, it did sort of lead me to that question. Okay, so what do you do about these people who actually might be sort of kooky conspiracy theorists, but are not necessarily therefore wrong, right, about these anomalies? And they talked, and it kind of it wasn't all about current events. It was, partially it was about, science, and it was about, Eric Weinstein's sort of challenge to string theory as a kind of a washed up thing that never delivered what it promised, at least from his perspective. And so they talked about that too. At what point, does somebody who at the beginning of string theory says, this isn't going to pay off, get vindicated? Right. Or are they still, kooks? Are they still wrong? And I think that's going to be increasingly an issue in our sort of fragmented media where facts aren't facts anymore and truth isn't truth.
Well, the climate thing is the obvious one for that. Go back to the original 1960s claims. In effect, they haven't actually yet happened. And yet we're out of date. We're past the sell-by date of those. In the next 30 years, back in the 60s, we're going to run out of food. No, because things happen. And the thing that I find all the way through that sort of thing is we also seemingly forget that other things have happened, and or the actual the total package of the statement is not true. And one of the ones they pick up is the Reagan gloating over this decrease in the oil price as being, look, this is big business, this is entrepreneurs doing this, we're finding more oil. And it's not, because 9/10 of the oil being price checked is all through the cartel called OPEC. Which is
another example of that, of something happening, but we're burning through it, is food production in this country became heavily dependent upon irrigation. And I don't know if you just this last week or so, they're talking about now how we're dangerously depleting the aquifers through those center ring irrigation,
especially the Oglala. Yeah, those deep wells into that runoff on the east side
the notion
of the
that we're going to run out of food. Well, yeah, we did find another way, but we found a way to draw down naturally occurring resources. So it's not, it's true, but it's not true. That was a good prediction, and now we're making it even worse, perhaps by ruining the stopgap measure of using aquifers instead of rain.
Yeah, well, and after the Dust Bowl, that entire West Texas, Oklahoma, Western Nebraska, area that was the Dust Bowl, is now under even more production than before the disaster, using these center pivot, deep well, aquifer draining things. And the aquifer takes 1,000 years to refill. So even if we get the type of rains that we have in the past, which may not actually even be the case, but yeah, so that there's that, but when Ehrlich in the population bomb said, there is no way to prevent this in the next 10 to 20 years, hundreds of millions of people will die, because of this, because of famine. That didn't seem to happen, right? Because the global net increase was positive still, but hundreds of millions of people did die of famine. Actually, he was right. And what happened was that the United Nations changed the way they account for deaths so that they no longer counted deaths from famine. So it was very difficult to actually put a number to that. It's kind of almost, if you were a conspiracy theorist, you might think almost in response to the fact that he predicted that. And then we kind of, the way we tell that story is that then the Club of Rome, and Donella Meadows and her husband, kind of did this thing that was much more sort of responsible, and it was based on computers, right? And it had, these, these half a dozen variables that they could twist the dials on each of them and see the different responses in this, in the feedback loops in the system and all of that. Some of the things that Meadows has said recently are kind of alarming, though, because along with that, and then they did that, they did that 2008 or whenever, when the 30-year retrospective kind of came out and looked at, and actually showed that the observations were sort of tracking with the collapse in the mid 21st century scenario, which was alarming, or at least would urge or suggest strongly that somebody might want to take a look at that and see. Now the thing about these these things, these observations tracking the curves that they drew, was that it's still the pre-collapse phase, right? So the things, these measures are still increasing, right? They haven't peaked and begun to drop off yet. So the assumption that is going to happen is still an assumption. But it would suggest at least kind of taking a closer look and really understanding kind of what's going on here. But and that's the problem, is a lot of the times these ideas come to us as packages, right? So so people can people say, oh, the Meadowses, right? They're the gods of this limits to growth thing, and yet other things that come out of their mouths are concerning, right? The idea that we that the carrying capacity of the planet is 1 to 2 billion people, and we have to find a way to get there, which he has recently said on camera. That needs to be investigated.
It also depends on what do we do with, for instance, E.O. Wilson's 50-50 split, and how would you, unless you ended up with, say, the equivalent of the Columbus coming along with their biological warfare that they didn't even know they were really coming along with.
Right.
And then 150 odd years later, you've got all the Northern European colonists coming over for New England, and it's oh, we can improve this empty land because it's now materially empty.
Right.
And until you get back down to something akin to that, and you then turn around and say, yeah, okay, let's leave Africa and the Americas and Australia and the Pacific Islands to the wildlife and put everybody back on Eurasia and leave the rest of the planet alone. And leave as though it is Antarctica, as in it's a scientific laboratory, and leave it alone, just to see what happens. Right? And then what do you do with the rest of the growth in anything? Because you'll always have people that say, oh, the chances of them finding me when I get on a boat and go to Tahiti, for instance, knowing full well that it doesn't take a lot of effort to live on the fruits and fish of Tahiti. You can get 50 people over there quite easily. Those 50 will become 250 very quickly, maybe get spotted and get moved back to Eurasia, hopefully, or they just say, oh, we'll just put anthrax in there and leave them to it. So
there is a.
If you follow through with the Kim Stanley Robinson couple of novels that I've mentioned about this coming and a little bit longer in the future, his one that is 2140 New York City, that's now surrounded by a huge dam wall.
Yeah, but
to keep some of the water out. But most of New York is now better off served by water taxes than Venice. So the bottom 10 floors are often underwater or have been waterproofed, and now when you look out the window, you see fish swimming past. One of the slightly more fruitcake type characters is a celebrity woman whose celebrity is she takes her clothes off for manga type productions. She's decided she's going to save the polar bear. And one of the things she does is she tours the world, because there are no aircraft to a certain extent anymore. She does it by an airship. So it has carrying capacity, but it takes a couple of weeks to go from the north to the south. So she goes and collects 10 polar bears and a big pile of fish, carries them off to Antarctica, drops them there, and leaves it. I bet she makes a film of it doing while she's doing, but that film's done with clothes on because it's a serious film as opposed to entertainment.
And it's cold
so,
in Antarctica.
well, yeah. But ice cubes are a standard feature of, anyway. And of course, the green arm response is to go and shoot all the polar bears before they decimate the penguins.
They're invasive species. Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's funny. I wrote a novel about airships once. Didn't quite finish it. I love airships, and it was one where they didn't go to New York. They didn't go to a submerged New York, but they did go to a submerged Miami, because it was sort of airships and Latin America, and it interested me that you could. I was really fascinated with the idea of flying airships to Bolivia, to these really high elevation places, and the effect of just the effect of elevation and oxygen levels and things like that on people, and also and also the dangers of using hydrogen rather than helium, but hydrogen is so much more cheaper and easier to get your hands on if you're doing this in any type of volume. But it was kind of about centralization and decentralization and the sort of the anarchists of the global south and stuff. I loved the whole just the whole imagery of moving at that speed, at that elevation, at like 3,000 meters generally, what's going on in the cloudscape, kind of what's going on, what's above you, what's below you, sort of thing. Really, really kind of fascinated me. And then what happens when you reach, things that, elevations that are higher than your normal. If you engineer an airship, to be able to carry X amount of payload at a particular atmospheric pressure, then what happens when you get to the Andes or the Himalayas or something? So yeah, I thought that was all very, it's kind of interesting. You go down these rabbit holes of sort of trying to understand enough of the the technology or the engineering or the science behind something in order to have a relatively plausible scene setting and world building and plot. And that was one of the things that really kind of struck me with the idea that that oftentimes you get away with so much. You can get away with so much because as readers or as viewers, we want to fill in the gaps, right? We want to basically make it a seamless whole. And we, and so we sort of collaborate in that process. And, and although I think there are benefits to having more technology, like series like The Expanse, I think was praised heavily for trying to be, more technologically accurate. But in any case, that's
you say that, Dan, and I had a curious experience yesterday. I met in person my very first lunar urban planner here in Pasadena, and my favorite I wrote down a quote she said, and I only wrote half the sentence down because it was hilarious. One of my favorite lunar geophysicists, because everyone should have one.
Yeah. Yep.
Was
so was there any news in that context? Was there any news about the Indians at the South Pole? Have they found water?
No, she didn't cover that. It was,
okay.
But it was interesting to meet somebody who's thinking about urban planning on both the moon and Mars.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh yeah, we're gonna need it soon.
Somebody needs to be thinking about that. Yeah, that's cool. So I was a little bit disappointed, and actually, really, I was sort of demotivated when I got to this, especially this kind of final chapter 15. When they started rewriting the whole in a very partisan way, right? Like that, that Trump didn't start warp speed. That Trump was responsible for, all of these increased mortality and cost from not taking it seriously, as demonstrated by the fact that, that he said some things about hydroxychloroquine, so that means he's an idiot. Because that was the history that was that whole, that's what I was talking about in my blog post today about, or yesterday about, that was the narrative at the time, and nobody really effectively countered it, and so it became the history, and so now they're telling it as if it's the history,
or just bleach,
or bleach, or bright lights inside your body, which whatever. Out of kinds. But then the idea that that it was Biden that saved us. I think that there's something a little bit disingenuous about the chronology, and honestly, if they're going to do the same things that they're criticizing other people for doing, then that kind of cuts the legs out of that.
But it seems to me like this is the second book we've read that was mostly history based or history underpinned, and they take a time period and look at it and do generally a really good job. And then in the last chapter or two, the author goes in a different direction and kind of talks about something outside of what they've been doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of I don't know, the whole thing kind of collapses because of the last two chapters.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of like you. I think I wish I hadn't read the last chapter and it just stopped at 14 and been like, okay, this was a thing, this was great.
Yeah.
And then, but it's almost like too many of these authors either at the last minute want to put in the thing to give it current context, which there's not they've gone through and looked at almost 100 years of history and really contextualized most of it really well.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly they're looking at something that happened yesterday and taking it completely out of that context they've built.
Yeah.
So is that a deadline driven thing, or I would like to add the next step when the step hasn't really landed properly?
Or yeah, hey, we can increase sale, we can increase book sales, by 500,000 if we talk, if we tie it to, the present moment. But then it's sort of like it's clickbait, right? And it's chasing eyeballs using exactly the things that they're arguing against when they're saying that that the algorithm is encouraging people to choose the content that they present and the way that they present it in order to maximize clicks.
Or it's the publisher, in this case, maybe saying, hey, how can you make this relevant? Do something in the last chapter that brings it to now. So that when
don't let this book be treated purely as history or something like that.
Yeah, and it may be that they're also looking at this and it's so obvious to them that this is right because they're in their own bubble, right? That they, that this is reality. And that I think, and it's funny too, because I used to, when I first started grad school in my master's program, one of my very first classes, we had, it was a sort of an intro to history sort of a thing for grad students. And we had to sort of write, I remember writing an essay defending Wikipedia at the time for being a democratization of kind of information. I went back to grad school in 2006 and I got a master's in 2007. And then we tried to move to South America. And then by 2009, that had failed and we were back in New England, and I started at UMass in like 2009 and finished my coursework in late 2011, early 2012, and moved back to Minnesota. But another thing that so in addition to defending Wikipedia, I remember the professor said, nothing that happened less than 50 years ago can really be kind of talked about by historians. And I disagreed with that at the time, because at that time, 50 years ago would have disqualified the Vietnam War, for crying out loud. And I thought that, certainly those types of things needed to be talked about. Nowadays, I'm starting to think that maybe the pendulum has swung the other way, and we need to be super careful about, sort of sifting through, what is factual and what is what is filter bubble factual, right? What is biased in that way that we may not even be able to see now. And also, like I said yesterday, to at least, if not completely believe, at least, memorialize and make note of these dissents, right? So that they will remain part of the record, and we can go back, maybe later on and sort of look at them more, more objectively. I think that filter bubbles have sort of reinstated that caution.
Curious if you think we are, so we can go back and look at history 100 years ago, and the history 100 years ago is not, in overall shape, not dramatically different than the history 100 years before that or 500 years before that. But there seems to be kind of a quickening of history, and things are moving quicker and faster now, and cultural and social changes faster now than it was 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, I think there's that, but I think also
we need better windows. Do we need better windows on the views? So usually they say, a president has to be dead for 50 years before you can know were they a great president or not, or maybe 100 years,
right,
to see what the long-term effect is. But do we maybe,
or in England until the expiration of the official secrets, right? Yeah, but I think I think you're right, Chris. But I think the other thing that's happened is there's been such a proliferation of ways that it's legitimate to do history and to think about history, right? Beginning with kind of the new social history in the 70s, and this idea that we do want to hear more voices, we do want to see more perspectives, we do want to think about, things that are not just, the elite records of elite people, published in elite ways, and those are the only things that we're gonna consider as valid sources. So yeah, I think that there's been a lot. I think that both of those things have sort of exponentially sort of increased the material available, but then also the kind of the responsibility to sort of effectively deal with it and to assess and evaluate kind of what demographics says in response to to state papers and political speeches and things like that, or newspaper articles.
So if we take that to some level, it also means that you're at least a generation plus away from the event, and so you aren't quite that tired. And I mean, when I first went to Germany, we did it as an exchange student swap, and one of the comments of my dad, who was bombed as a sort of preschool, early school years kid, was, and that was an example of the master race. This was a long-haired hippie teenager of 13. No, wasn't even teenager really, 13 actually. So just teenager, whose older brother was trying to make sure he hadn't addressed in Berlin, because the army can't send letters to Berlin to send him his call-up papers for national service. And that obviously was at the height of the Cold War. It wasn't quite the height of but Cold War, big time, pre-Reagan, but post-Kennedy. So we're sort of 72, 73. And it's like, I've got, once removed by marriage, in-laws, etc., whose family have been turfed off their land that they've had for generations, and they've had to emigrate because they've got nowhere to go. And between them, they're now spread over, oddly enough, China, Germany, and the UK. And they have no real tangible history. There's no ongoing country that they are tagged with. I mean, Brits, to a certain extent, we went everywhere, and by the look of our faces on screen, we're all pretty much bulk Northwest Europeans. So we could probably track back a decent amount of distance. But as soon as you start getting mixed families, and as soon as you start having people who are disinvested as a dysphoria for whatever reason, I mean, even with the few Indians that I know, some of them are ex-Ugandan, as in they got kicked out by Idi Amin because they were seen as being British, except they were 2 or 3 or 4 generations Ugandan, and therefore that move broke the regional or the caste system that would have meant that certain individuals wouldn't have married, wouldn't have known each other properly, etc., etc.
Right,
So,
right, because they're an expat community, so they mix.
Because they're now an Indian expat. That's much more important than which village are you from and what caste are you from.
Right.
That may have still persisted in the first generation, but ignored by the third generation, and much the same as the Caribbean blacks in the UK. You don't, after the third generation, you don't care whether they're from Barbados, Turk and Cyprus or Jamaica. You're Caribbean.
Right.
Yeah.
My parents were both 100% Italian, but my mother's family was from way farther north. My father's family was from Calabria, the tip of the boot, and my mother's family was from north of Naples, which for Calabrians is northern Italy, the Abruzzi. Although I met some people from Bergamo who actually told me that that not only is Naples but Rome is also in southern Italy. Recently.
Well, at least you weren't Sicilian then.
Yeah, but so they were from their families were from places where they would never have and of course going back just a couple of generations from their birth, Italy wasn't even a nation, but even so, in America, my father was the only one of his siblings that married an Italian, and so his grandmother loved my mother. It didn't matter that she was from the north, and they were, then they weren't in Italy. They wouldn't have been friendly. She was Italian. So what did I guess I wanted to ask about since you mentioned the 70s. In the earlier chapter, she and he spent some time sort of talking about Jimmy Carter and almost, I thought, sort of waxing kind of lyrical about how the Carter technocracy was going to be this thing that prevented the pendulum from swinging the other way, but it wasn't to be. And then along comes Reagan and the pendulum swings. What do you think of that whole?
It seemed, even to me, it seemed very partisan. At this distance back then, I didn't know things I now know about American politics. Other than, could I name the president? Yes. Could I name the vice president? Probably not. Could I name the party? Also possibly not. But I mean, the thing that I found that I don't think was in this book was the political machinations by the Republicans and Reagan campaign that held back on the Iranian hostages to make sure that it was seen as being a Reagan thing rather than a Carter thing.
Where the Ayatollah was so politically canny. We never give him credit for for being not only a religious leader but a consummate politician.
Yeah. I'm wondering in that sort of vein with things like Brexit, as in So what will be the solution for the Northern Ireland war?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what that solution does it mean we go back to the undeclared virtual civil war, or do we just go back to drug running and basic criminality
Mm-hmm.
that supported that undeclared civil war?
Yeah.
None of the main actors existed in our old places, old positions to an extent, except, of course, you just know all of that bias is being thumbed into the kids, and you've only got, I mean, if we stick with the Italians, you've only got to stick with The Godfather or Sopranos to know that as soon as dad goes, the kids are going to come back up and continue the family business.
Mm. Yeah.
Or get replaced by the whatever Eastern Europeans as they apparently have in New Jersey and New York.
Yeah, there was probably a very interesting transition moment that some historian ought to look at when when there was a shift in used to be you couldn't get made unless you were a Sicilian. And then at some point there was a transition, and then you could be an Italian, and then you could be Italian on one side, and it had to be your father's side. But then and it just kind of kept the basket kept widening and widening and widening.
The reverse of that, of course, is the German purity laws.
Yeah.
Or even the idea of whiteness in America that has shifted over time, and where does that go in the next 100 years?
Yeah. It's kind of another thing that kind of struck me about this when we're kind of talking about this transition. I think there's some partisanship in this. Carter leads to Reagan thing, but I thought that they told a really good story about GE and Reagan, and that connection, because I think that was I haven't seen that in kind of mainstream histories of sort of explaining the rise of Ronald Reagan. Just the sort of the ubiquity that came with being the face of GE in other places beyond just California. I mean, I get the Screen Actor Guild California connection, but explaining Reagan in sort of Rust Belt America, I thought that was really effective.
Well, an interesting thing to me, even connecting to current times, is did Reagan begin to believe his scripts?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so obviously he made some kind of transition, from liberal to conservative, or belief in government and whatever. But was that a function of him seeing the light from his perspective, or was he playing a game? Or because that's the same thing that's coming up now. Are you wrong simply because you thought you were right? And so it's okay, or whatever. I don't know how you.
Yeah.
Did he really believe the elections were stolen versus did he really believe the government was this or that? And when did that change occur? And was it true? I mean, was it legitimate or?
Well, the thing I thought with the GE and Ronald's growth was when the few paragraphs they had explaining what they thought was why he got the fire from GE was where he seemed to, from GE's perspective, step over the line. Mm-hmm. But obviously from the GOP perspective, it was just the next step along the free market fanaticism. Mm-hmm. And it's the thing that I thought somewhat was missing was things like the stuff we see in the newsroom fiction from Sorkin with the Tea Party and with Rhino, Republican in name only, as opposed to you are a Republican old style, as in, what does that mean anymore? Does it mean you're, Eisenhower type person? You want the safety net, you want businesses to hold their own, which is one of the reasons why I've mentioned in the past here and elsewhere, as in, when are you guys going to admit that Walmart is a communist country, is a communist company, because it relies on Social Security to pay the bulk of its staff the wages to which they can live on.
Right, and food stamps and
However it does it, right? It does it via your tax dollars.
Right.
So if you're a shareholder of Walmart, you are sucking on the government tit daily.
Absolutely.
So how does that get squared with, you've got to let this, free market, and that's the one thing they never seem to explain totally. Was how is this schizophrenic mind of free marketers actually set?
And I think they partially tried to explain that in their description of Reagan, right? Of his attraction. I mean, I never thought of Reagan as the brightest bulb, and I think that caused a lot of people to underestimate him, sort of going into even the 1980 election. But that preference for anecdote over data, right? It's almost like it. I mean, and it is a big element of storytelling, and I think he does get.
Well, that's the part of the chapter title, the thing about the story or something like that, the love story.
Yeah. Well,
but is that also not because of his background? The actor. He clearly has the understanding of what a camera can do. And you go back to, say, Kennedy versus Nixon, and Nixon didn't understand what television was going to do to him.
Right.
And he just looked bad. Compared to the not that much younger. I don't think he was even that much. I mean, it wasn't a decade even, I don't think.
Right.
That much younger, but Kennedy, who was with makeup, black and white TV, therefore not sweating, but actually being able to talk to the camera.
It looked like a generational change. Yeah.
And had this is the new upcoming way to be. And it's the same, pretty much the same with Maggie Thatcher. When she got elected party leader, when she wasn't in power, when the Tories weren't there, nobody rated her. But over the next few months, all of the PR people and the TV people, and how to speak and how to dress, how to tell a story, that is no longer a parliamentary speech, but is a speech to the high polloi, the plebs, and everybody else. You could see she just changed so much. And then, of course, she got, inverted commas, lucky, I suppose, with the Falkland War.
Yeah. I thought that one of the most brilliant moments was the Salman Rushdie to Tony Blair thing from apparently recalled by Joseph Anton at the beginning of part 3, where Tony's saying, "I turned away from Mick Hucknall's hot girlfriend to listen to you." And you were talking about liberty, but what the hell were you? Market freedom? Is that a new labor thing? That I thought that was brilliant. One of the things that I think may be happening here, maybe kind of part of the story, is this preference for simplification, right? And I think that was an element of Carter that was problematic, right? Was that he was too complex, he was too nuanced, He actually sort of wore a sweater, and said, "Turn your thermostat down," and that we're partially responsible, and it's not just some other bad guy. And Reagan was much less. Reagan was not about the nuance. He was about the soundbite and the factoid and the anecdote, and kind of simplified things for people in a way. It seemed to me that sort of fed into their confirmation biases as well, right? That made it easy for you to kind of double down on what you already believe in, and find a justification.
Well, even on that front, and I'm sure we can all appreciate this. Reagan had a booklet of index cards with quotes from famous people that he would take out and drop into speeches on a regular basis. I haven't checked in a while because they still were having lockdown issues, but I keep meaning to go to the Reagan Library to see his collection. Although it's actually a piece that's owned by the foundation and not by the library, so you got to get special permission as well. But I think there's an interesting dichotomy too between Carter and Reagan and the times in which they grew up. So Reagan grew up in Dixon, Illinois, which is essentially it's a fly speck. It's a slightly bigger city now, obviously, than when he grew up there. But it's roughly, not even now, I think it's about 9,000 people in Dixon, Illinois, surrounded by farmlands. So it goes from the countryside to the big city. And I have a feeling that shift, probably as much as anything, is responsible for his change in politics. And there's always been this dichotomy in America. And even going back to ancient Greece, it's the countryside that provides the agricultural farmland and support that allows the city to be the city. And that tension, I think, still exists in America, of the farmland supporting the big cities, and the difference between what each of those groups of people have or don't have. But Reagan's doing that in a time period when globalization is just starting to get its feet. Massive trade, and he goes from a tiny town to one of the biggest, not only one of the biggest cities in America, but one of the biggest media markets in America, and then builds a platform from there. Versus Carter, who is usually cast as, we don't give him enough credit for the intelligence and education he had.
Right.
And he's usually cast as the countryside, peanut farmer from Georgia.
Yeah.
And within less than a generation, we go from him becoming president and making him get rid of the peanut farm and divest to, the super industrialist, Trump. Oh, he doesn't need to divest anything. It's just part and parcel. Who cares?
Right.
But I think those two things of the countryside versus the city, and in globalization, in the periods in which they were kind of growing up and coming out and becoming who they were, there's kind of an interesting super dichotomy between those two presidents in that time period.
Yeah. Well, and it'd be interesting to look at sort of Earl Butts's ag policy in the first, in the Reagan administration after. FDR came from the Roosevelts. He was a rich, he was a rich member of this multi-branched, founding family of New York. But it is interesting, that Reagan was an FDR. He voted for FDR 4 times. But that doesn't surprise me that much, because Reagan was a big government, big spending, kind of technocrat in his own way. And the New Deal was very much about, kind of technocracy. So I think that it's that it's important to sort of separate the Reagan rhetoric from the Reagan, kind of reality of what he actually did.
Well, that was the other thing that came up in.
Sorry, go ahead.
That was the other thing that came up with GE and Reagan's story. When that story continued on to when he became governor of California, one of the notes I've got down as being so we got GE's propaganda of Reagan becoming a company man, and then we've also got the Reagan thing as a Republican market fundamentalist, with things like let's raise taxes on the stuff that is working man targeted, like alcohol, petrol, tobacco. Mm-hmm. It's a bigger, significant expenditure for the blue collar worker than it is for others. Mm-hmm. And in the same throw, you've got GE particularly, I think it was said, but it might have been other sorry, it might have been other companies as well. Let's go and relocate the factories and this was one of the standard things I just love about your stuff, your politics, a right to work state.
Right to work, yeah.
as opposed to a right not to work.
Yeah. I think that maybe one of those things that Reagan learned from GE, because I do think that there is, Tim, I think you're right, and I think, Chris, what you were saying about Reagan sort of becoming a believer in the script is probably accurate as well. Ooh, biblical quote, cool. But I think that maybe the other thing that Reagan picked up from GE was propaganda, right? That you could be doing things with your left hand and saying things, facing the other way, that didn't have to match, right?
Well, it's even worse, and because he's come from a Hollywood setting where the Hollywood PR machine can sell, Rock Hudson as the sexy male masculine movie star, but meanwhile behind the scenes, so he's known and been mired in this system where exactly that has been happening. Here's the reality. He knows those people and he knows what that reality is. Meanwhile, he can read the newspapers and magazines and know that a totally different reality is being sold to the public. And all you need to do is just package it the right way. But he's also been given platforms to allow himself to do that from a political perspective.
Yeah.
I think an interesting experiment may actually be to look at Reagan's youth in the countryside and then movement into politics and what that looked like then versus J.D. Vance doing the same thing.
Yeah, same thing.
I'm going to like Yale and then Hillbilly Elegy and then his move into politics. And does his politics mirror that same type of Reagan setup, or is it a totally dramatically different thing? And is Vance representing the people he grew up with, or is he representing something else altogether?
That's really an interesting observation. I've had the same reaction having read Hillbilly Elegy. I thought I was just shocked. It's like, yeah, Vance was right, but now he's using that in a manipulative way rather than, just explaining why these people who you think aren't benefiting continue to support Republican ideals. It doesn't make any sense. And, Vance had a way of explaining that. And now my reaction is, well, okay, I wouldn't have bet at the time of reading that book that, somehow he would have used those insights in what I consider kind of a negative, manipulative way.
Yeah, well,
there's one other interesting, I think, issue in some of these chapters that maybe it bears on this reality versus story distinction. The authors kind of have this thing about, well, some of these ideas about politics, what if you treat these political theories as testable? And you say, okay, we tried to test them and they were failures. Why don't we? And it's like, from a kind of a scientific empirical perspective, what is it about these ideas that persist despite their obvious failures? And is it this because the story still sounds good, the theory still sounds good, and people have ignored the consequences? I mean, you go back to the Reagan situation, and okay, so he was against big government, but the book says he doubled the state budget in California, and that didn't seem to ever stop him from using the same arguments to get into the White House, despite the failure, obviously, of his theory if you test it in California.
But he proved his theory that you could continue, that you could propagandize, right? That you could talk about this and it would be successful, because nobody was looking at what was actually happening. I mean, one of the you mentioned Rock Hudson. The thing, and the immediate thing that kind of popped into my head was J. Edgar Hoover. And and Whitney Webb has recently made a big, kind of tried to draw this line of sexual blackmail and corruption, from sort of that era to the present with this, Jeffrey Epstein, who I thought it was really interesting. The Weinsteins decided, or Eric Weinstein, I think it was, who said Jeffrey Epstein was a construct. And his brother didn't get it at all. And he had to kind of explain it, sort of piece by piece, that there was never a hedge fund, right? Because there's documentation of trades and, who, and where were they and all that. So that this was this, so that whole persona was was kind of a cover. But that whole idea that there is, that reality is irrelevant, to a really big extent. And I think you're right. I think that probably does come from Hollywood, come from not only, obviously, okay, we're creating fantasies on screens and things like that, for a living, but also that Hollywood culture of pretending that, that Rock Hudson is the man's man, the macho, star, and all of that.
But again, you talk about the value of time and history. Looking back, didn't anybody at the time say, "Hey, look what kind of governor he was in California. Look what he did to the government budget in California." And now he's claiming that we have too much government. How does that make any sense? I mean, wasn't he ever challenged? Well, I have no clue. I mean, I was completely ignorant of these things. I, remember these things. I mean, I remember Reagan, but I don't remember the campaign or the accusations or what the counter positions were.
Or did anyone get any traction with that? Because I think the thing that they also do well in that GE chapter is to sort of document how much GE owned media, in all those local papers, in all those places, not that they owned the paper, but they were the biggest advertiser in all these markets, right? And just how much actually effective control, that probably gave them, the ability to put, because media, and especially in a competitive format, right? When, you've got to have something on the page, you've got to fill the paper every day, right? And so people are using and syndicating, content like crazy. If you've got this content mill and it seems nonpartisan, right? It seems reasonable, it seems plausible, and it seems mainstream.
Well, a good example of that was, obviously, go back to Maggie Thatcher again. She's now dead, and been dead for a while. Yet, when Johnson had managed to get in number 10 and was pushing Brexit through, and there was elements of when we leave Europe, what do we do about things like pollution limits and international agreements and all this? And he said, Maggie solved that. She closed down the coal industry, as though the reason that it was closed down was it was polluting. No, it was closed down because it was union busting. The same as right? And it's like, you know, Maggie was I think she was Minister for Education when the miners and the power strikers in the UK got together and turned the power off. So we had rolling blackouts. And, you know, I can remember doing school homework by candlelight, right? Because you couldn't get enough miners' lamps to go, you know. So it's purely political, and now, of course, it's almost 40 years. So some things are coming out of the archives and everything, and there are a couple of journalists who've done their history book on the miners' strike and stuff, and some of those are going to have to be read and looked at. But in parallel and at the same time, you also had Maggie and Reagan and the Cold War situation, where you guys asked us, could we become aircraft carrier number one for nuclear cruise missiles? And we said yes, and obviously that gained a big protest. But that protest was allowed because it had no real economic knock-on.
I'm going to interrupt you for just a sec, Tim, so that we can answer John's question so he can go. What do we want to read next?
I have no idea. I didn't have a look at the list. But...
Okay. I mentioned it last week, I think. I would be interested in kind of going back to something like Who Owns the Future? But the other one that was suggested, Mark, was this Science of Reading. Is that and I haven't really looked at that. Is that
well, it's a historical account of the reading wars, you know, which are kind of in the news again today. You know, how far they've gone, how long that's been around. And there's a lot of familiar side issues concerning the politics and the purpose of reading, the purpose of becoming educated. I admit I've only read about a third of that book. I'm working on this book is eating up all the time I have almost, but I've been trying to read that book as well. Maybe you should wait. I'll work on it more.
Okay. And then I was kind of scrolling through a list, and lower down the list, there was also a suggestion, maybe Chris, you made it at first, that we maybe read a pile of articles.
Well, the reason I got interested in the reading book is I was trying to, I mean, this is all interesting. I'm still interested also in all the note taking, learning, whatever.
Right. I also kind of feel like it might be a good idea to bounce back to that.
A little bit more of that. I don't know.
Yep.
But if reading come note taking comes back, that's fine. But then do we not pick up a more classic book, as in How to Read a Book, or we take Mark's one and look at the reading rules?
I was kind of thinking of Adler. I was thinking of Adler too. It might be a good way to force myself to really plow through that.
Yeah, I liked How to Read a Book. I mean,
Shall we?
Or are there two things that look like they might kind of, while we're speaking of Adler, things that might overlap well in terms of something like Adler that's a little more historical or, you know, goes back, but that looks at something like the history of reading. And, you know, do people still do that now? I think a lot of that critical thinking and comparing one text against another, it just doesn't exist.
But I'm interested in the topic of books, you know, and there's a lot of interesting recent stuff about, there's always been, you know, decline, but how few books people read. And, you know, to Dan's thing, what is, you know, what, even the fact that we're interested in maybe isolated things rather than books per se, what is the unique value of an author writing a book, as opposed to, you know, why would we rather read Substack things rather than the book by the same person or whatever? That's
what if we did Adler and the science of reading synoptically? I mean, we could take, we wouldn't have to like try to crush through it. I mean,
let's do how to read a book, and then I will work further on this other one and see what I think. All right. Because it's interesting to me because a lot of this stuff is a rehash of my own life experiences. So talks about Huey, you know, going back, and that was one of the first things, even though that was an early 20s book that I read when I became interested in reading and learning from written material and note taking and all that stuff. So, I mean, I like the stuff because it's almost like reliving my life as a professional to some extent. That doesn't mean that anybody else would care. And I haven't gotten to the transition into the very politicized issue of books and reading and who controls what people read, which is kind of our present day. I assume that's where these authors are going. But again, until I read the rest of it, I'd say, okay, let's take a classic and then, you know, let me read the rest of the book and see if I continue to.
So what you're saying, Mark, is that you didn't use Adler's advice and skim through the majority of the book first to see where is it going, to then do the deeper read.
Right. I'm guessing on where it goes.
There you go. All right. So, so you can reflect on how that worked out. Well, so the part one of Adler's book is about 50 something pages long, 59, 58 pages long. And it's the dimensions of reading. And it has about 5 chapters in it. About the levels, and you know, and that would be that might be, and then probably part 2 we'd want to cut into because that's like that's 100 pages long. We'd probably want to cut that into 2 sections. But yeah, shall we try to do that?
Yeah,
do that, and yeah, that'll work.
Okay. We want to start next week.
Yeah. Yeah, why don't we do Adler part 1 next week? And maybe I'll review.
So we not reading the 1940 edition?
Well, I don't know. We're reading what I'm looking at from the I think that the table of contents I'm looking at is from the Touchstone 2014 reissue of the 1972 edition, I'm guessing.
Can you put up the Kindle or whatever link so we get the same one here?
Yeah. Hang on, here it comes.
I put that up because I think I have copies of both. And I can't, one of them I know I was rereading a year or 2 ago, and I did a lot of annotation and hypothesis.
Yeah, I was just about to say, first place I'm going is not the book, but it's going to be Chris's hypothesis to see what he said.
I think it'll be interesting because I think I have an old hardcover version of it somewhere, and it hadn't really occurred to me to do that. But that's interesting too.
Also, in case before John disappears, just in case he hasn't dropped into the community chat in Obsidian. What version 1.45 is out, and that has some big new changes for Obsidian.
I think I'll watch the YouTube first.
Yeah, well, the YouTube came out a month ago. If you
Okay.
look at if you follow Nicole, because she's on the inside early beta testers and all that, she was showing you how it was being used.
Mhm.
But obviously, she was looking at the equivalent of 1.40. They've now released 1.45 to the general public.
Mhm.
And of course, in passing, somebody, I can't remember where it was now, but I put a link in the Obsidian chat. Somebody mentioned Chris in passing about doing Zettelkasten type card note taking and hypothesis.
And was it the classic Chris quote of "It's older than Luhmann," or was it something additional?
It wasn't the classic. It's older than Luhmann, but it would have taken you there quite quickly. But it was Chris.
Cool.
You know, picture as well.
Oh wow!
Just a link.
Nice.
Not just a link. So I'm pretty sure, if I remember rightly, I did put the whole link in the chat, in the community forum thing.
Yep, I see it.
Cool. Yeah, just so you can go and have a look at yourself,
Nice.
see how much you changed.
All right, cool.
Well, now I got to pay my publicity bill.
There you go. All right, see you later, John.
Bye.
So, do we have more things we want to say about this before we leave Naomi and Eric?
It was a good choice. This was a 5 for me in terms of the good choice.
Yeah, I think that there were some interesting things that I will sort of add to my my kind of understanding of the rise of Reagan. I think really that the importance of GE, I think, had been sort of underappreciated, and I think they really kind of point that out. The whole magical thinking thing, I think, was well stated, and I thought was important to state. I don't think I don't think I learned that much from that. It blows my mind that the Foundation for Economic Education is now doing sort of critical drinker movie reviews. It's like, really, guys?
The thing that given it was, I think, my original suggestion, or equally my original suggestion, and I would have voted for Conway and Erastus anyway. And I've read quite a bit of Suprin and Erastus where he does a little bit more on the propagandizing generally. What I was disappointed in part, I think, was this didn't really come over as well as being part 2 to Merchants of Doubt, and was focusing on the pollution side, the environmental side. But since Pat's not with us again, I think there's still that book 3 hanging around somewhere.
Right.
But how far that would then drift off, because I must admit, I'm still ploughing through very slowly. Silent Spring Revisited, which is actually a British author's visit to what happened since Silent Spring was published. But he's doing it as a chronological walkthrough of all the major environmental, legal things, other protests and catastrophes and all the rest of it, and how Europe wasn't really that green stroke. He's an ex-employee, or still an employee, I'm not quite sure, but I think he's an ex-employee of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, but has been pushing things like the big landowners to stop going after the raptors, to go after the gun birds, and therefore, therefore, you knock down the population such that you can't get a glorious 12 to shoot grouse in their millions. And the sheer amount of double dealing stroke not doing what you said you would do, both in terms of manifesto before you get elected, and even what you say in Parliament. As you know, we will give, amongst other things, like farmers a grant to plant native trees to make sure the birds have got something to eat, stroke, somewhere to live, etc., etc. And that started, and then it collapsed because, oh shit, they're claiming a lot of money. And then, of course, what you realise is, much the same with the usual thing that comes through here in terms of there's all these big business people saying government should get out of the way. Who's claiming all these grants? The big farmers, because they have the time and the staff to go through the red tape. Whereas the small farmer who really should be helped doesn't have the time, doesn't always have the wherewithal to do it, or the recognition that he could get, you know, enough money to redo all his hedges, which would be a big thing. And it's so similar to the Tories at the moment in the UK, where, you know, we'll fund home insulation, and then they walk away from that and change the grant details so much that the numbers of people applying is so small they can lose the program because it's not being taken up. You know, I mean, it's the same process that there were some figures released in the last couple of weeks that where back with Cameron, the then immigration system was taking an average of 6 weeks to clear 95% of all immigration claims, and was accepting X percentage, but was ensuring those that were outside that percentage went home. Whereas the current administration are taking well over 6 months to agree 5%, and the 95% that are not given leave to stay are not being sent home. So you're wasting all the time and money, yet you're not doing the apparent legal outcome of then deporting this, so say, undesirable or whatever. And then, of course, it was all based on, oh, it's all these Europeans coming. And given Alexander de Pfeffer, the other parts of Boris Johnson's name, was we're going to have 30 million Turks turn up on the doorstep when they get admitted to the EU, and they're all Muslim, as being that's a reason. When Alexander de Pfeffer's grandfather was Turkish, he happened to be born in the US, so he's really European. And before he became Prime Minister, had to give up his US passport, citizenship. And the numbers of people emigrating out of the UK now exceeds those coming in from the EU, but not quite those from the Commonwealth. So it's completely gone the wrong way. So the brown and black guys are coming in the Commonwealth, and the white guys that we want to trade with and have as plumbers and electricians have all gone home. So anyway, Chris.
Yeah, Chris, what were you were gonna throw something in?
I don't remember what it was. Okay. And I was trying to Oh, the API. Maybe they're private. I don't know. I'm trying to pull up the original PDF copy.
Yeah, because I've used Hypothesis, but was it part of a group that you participated in, or I mean, you had a separate?
I think I was reading it just for myself, but it was, I read it ages ago, and
Yeah, but you can still see your highlights and that kind of stuff.
yeah, they're still there. It may be.
It asked me for an API thing. Wouldn't let me in. I don't know if anybody else tried your link.
Oh, and it may have been too that I threw out a part of the URL or the search URL that did it, because that search thing does use the API key to pull it out. But if you give me a minute, I'll just give you the
Sure.
document or a link to the document, and you'll see all of it.
I can play with it some other time. If I had to get something specifically from you, I wanted to figure out what it was.
And I'm sure they haven't changed, except for maybe introductory material. That book has been that book for a million years. So
yeah, by the way, I just looked a little bit at the new Obsidian stuff. Has anybody actually tried I forget what they call that new labeling thing? Has anybody actually tried some of those options?
Not me.
yeah,
Because it comes up now in both my own Obsidian and the book club Obsidian thing announcing its
Right.
version.
Yeah, I'm looking at the main page, and looks like it has a lot of it's showing off a lot of those features, but it's not really explaining them.
Play with some of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I still haven't even really used Canvas.
Yeah, Canvas never was useful for me, and everybody I've ever seen, or at least the things I want out of Canvas, I want to be able to say, here's a folder, here are a bunch of linked files, or here's a single note, throw onto the canvas all the things that are linked to it within one or two jumps, so that I can then kind of move it around and look at it and organize it, create an outline. And then it'd be nice if I could go and say, okay, now here's this thing and it's an outline. Dump this map into a Word document so I can just edit that and there's an article.
Yeah.
I want the ability to do essentially digitally what I can do with index cards on the table.
Right.
And then not have to do okay, I've made the outline and ordered it, and now I have to then go through and retype or cut and paste each and every one of those into a document to do something with it. But the problem is I don't think there's a single note-taking anything that does anything remotely close to that, other than maybe the older what's his name's program from the late 90s, early 2000s.
Rocks?
No, and it's the one Steven Johnson uses and always talks about.
Oh.
And that's one of the few I think that comes close to that. But it's the old school desktop program. Or maybe Mark Bernstein's tool does a little bit of that, but only because he's been working at it for 20 years instead of 4 or 5.
Right. Well, and I think the learning curve on Bernstein stuff is just too extreme. I might just use this as my version that I read, Chris. Your illegal version of how to read a book.
So what is the change? I mean, okay, I've got both of them now. So what's the difference? Is one an update or a reissue, or?
I think it's just a reissue.
Yeah, they've just been reissuing it and writing it every.
Right, so now I've got 2 copies.
And if there's like an introduction or a forward or something, that's usually the one thing that'll shift.
Right. I got Hayek through a library now, and I'm trying to read that. Like I should really,
Oh, I was on
That's
a
the
conference.
problem. Once you start reading and then you read something, it just keeps going.
I was on a conference call earlier this week with a PhD student who is studying the effects of LibGen and Sci-Hub on academia and like access to material as a thing.
Oh wow.
And he's wrapping up his PhD, and it's one of those theses that I like, oh, I can't wait for this to be done so I can actually read it.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. That's what I've wondered about it. Because Obsidian and those kinds of concepts, the smart notes concept, would make so much sense in higher ed, especially for those, I'm out of now. We had, basically ways to keep track of the resources, through some kind of note. Not it didn't emphasize the notes, it emphasized the citations. There's a big difference between having a citation library and having this rich collection of material but it would, the whole idea of thinking into the future, or the smart note idea, I think is different than just highlighting something. It says, I want something for the future that will make sense in the future.
Yeah, right.
I can find, which
absolutely.
That's the one insight I got from the smart node concept.
Yeah.
If you had a good idea, now write it down. And don't just highlight something so that the idea makes some sense 2 years from now.
Right. I was just comparing the new version, the new Touchstone version and the previous Touchstone version. And once you get into the text, they look to be just about word for word identical.
Yeah. So it's the prettier cover is what you're getting.
Yes,
for the modern
it's a pretty
audience,
cover.
right?
It's a pretty cover.
And
I'm gonna just layer on some more hypothesis onto this version of it, I think. And I have been thinking actually sort of about, because I had a colleague or a family friend who is she was an executive director of a kind of a medium-sized regional nonprofit. And she decided, she got kind of burnt out of that, but then she basically went into business for herself, running sort of programs, leadership and conflict resolution and all kinds of different programs for nonprofits like the ones that she, because it occurred to her that nonprofits had budgets for trainings or I don't know how she put it, but there were some things that they couldn't afford, but then there was always a budget for for these things. So she found this niche, and she was sort of urging me to to become a like a writing coach for academics that actually want to get published. And I was, and I've been sort of mulling that over. I've been thinking, I don't know. I don't necessarily want to become people's ghostwriter. But no. I kind of like I'm working right now with the U.S. academic decathlon people. I'm reading their packet because they're doing an environmental history packet next year. And so I've been reading and commenting on that, giving the authors.
I do think there's something there, Dan. And the whole notion of, having been an academic, all this stuff came to me too late. The whole idea of how you build knowledge base that you can use in your writing and your research is really interesting. Who would, no one teaches you that. Your major professor, I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I never, when I was a grad student at UMass, I certainly never had anybody tell me, this is how you do primary research, and this is what you do with that stuff. And I was like transcribing, handwritten letters from the first half of the 19th century, like crazy. And, and that was sort of like, well, okay, now I've got, a card for each one of these things in Tinderbox, but what now?
Yeah, I know.
One of my favorite things, especially in a hypothesis, is I'm reading, I'll find some random name that's mentioned tangentially somewhere, and I'll highlight the sentence and tag it with that person's name. And then 6 months or 2 years later, I've totally forgotten who that person was. but I'll start typing their name in another thing I'm reading, and Hypothesis autofills because it remembers that I tagged something.
Sure.
And so I've taken to only using it in one browser so that the pre-filled fields are always the same.
Right. Yeah.
But I'm starting to type the name and the name pops up automatically. I'm like, I have no idea who this is. And then, but I can go back and look at the reference to the other thing, which then makes it a whole lot easier to tie bits and pieces together. And I'm always shocked by the dramatically disparate fields where these random names just regularly pop up, and it's huge value.
The link, once you start doing the linking in Obsidian, it then finds the unresolved links for you, and you can then go and say, yes, I agree, make me a page for that person.
Right.
You don't need to put anything in there. It's just a placeholder waiting for you to come across it again somewhere. Right. And once you've done it, once you start doing that, I mean, one of the things, partly because I quite liked his writing, but also recognised after I'd read a couple and then read some criticism of him about he was getting a bit political, which was all those magazine articles by Stephen J. Gould that he then made into books. He edited them slightly so the book flowed a bit more than just scrapbook sticking in some newspaper articles.
Sure.
But you can, once you've read a couple, you start to see certain names pop up and all this. That as an engineer, not doing biology since I was like 13, just never came up. Right? And as I've started shifting, 30,000+ notes out of Evernote into Obsidian, I very quickly, after I'd done the first few hundred, I thought, no, I'm doing this too quick. I need to, on the first thing I do when I've stopped reading and stopped highlighting is check in Evernote, does this name, concept, person, title, whatever it happened to be, exist already? If so, copy it over. But then put it into the inbox equivalent. So I haven't massaged this. I haven't broke it down to an atomic note. It's just it's the equivalent of a other raw cut and paste. So it needs to be processed, but there is at least one other note that is on a similar basis that has significant overlap. And when you do it that way, and you're a bit slower because you're doing it a bit more consciously, it really does grow what I'm always thinking as a long chain map, rather than those artificial clusters that you often see on the early Obsidian maps, where somebody has conscientiously said, like you do with some of the people on their YouTubes, they say, I was reading XYZ book, and the first thing I did was copy all the references into Obsidian. So it's like you've got this central hub of the book you're reading, and then all of a sudden you've got 350 circles around it that, one, you aren't going to read, two, they may well not be quoting them properly, but you haven't checked. But it makes it's very skewing of your belief to a certain extent.
I think it's been interesting to me to as I've been kind of going through it, as I've been sort of setting up my own website again, and sort of going through all this stuff that I had in these old Rapid Weaver files, to kind of pull these things in, and then as I'm dropping them into Obsidian, to like double bracket names and see where they connect to other things that that I've already got in there. I do think that it is that what you're saying, Tim, sort of stresses that importance of making time to actually kind of sit with stuff and reflect on it, and kind of follow these threads. And I sort of I had to remind myself, because they buried it, where the side, where that ability to make a local graph was, because it's down, you have to kind of follow it down that trail of the dot into the, and then there's an open linked view thing that you have to open a side window to open a local graph for. And that was unfortunate that was buried so deep.
Well, I'm just using similar with the dangling links plugin that does the unresolved notes, and if you add dangling links, you get more similar. But I was doing the equivalent of 900 captures within Evernote a month, easily.
Yeah.
And I'm down to like doing 100 within Obsidian. Stroke. Partly because I then, as I say, once I've captured it or about to capture it, the first thing I then do is go look at the old stuff and see, have I got it possibly? Have I got something similar, overlapping or whatever?
Right. Yeah, and I've been doing a similar thing with the local graph, looking at, okay, if I've got a purple, if I got a purple ball, that is, that's an empty, an empty node, and it's linking things. Well, then maybe that's something I should pay attention to.
Yeah. I mean, the other person that I've looked at is Morgan, who is a PhD writing student in Toronto, and one of the things she likes is periodically, and it sounds as though it's like a weekly habit at the close of the week, is let's go and touch all the unfilled notes that have been driven from the open links. And so it's and how much that would slow me down more, such that I will probably be down to say like 50 notes a week. So
you have
I'm
a link
not quite
for her?
sure. Yeah, she's on YouTube. Morgan something. There's a few letters on the end, but it's Morgan. And if you do Obsidian Morgan, you'll get her.
All right.
She's also done. She also got asked by Centro to do a review for them as a paid review, which she coughed up as being a paid review at the start. And so one or two people were worried that she might move off Obsidian. And she said, no, this is just a sideways view. And I'm beginning to use Canvas in a similar way. And she's, as I say, she does theatre, but when you listen to when she shows you some of the work, as opposed to demo stuff, there's pollution inside there. There's climate crisis. So she's clearly taking theatre as the optic, but let's make sure I spin this telescope round 360.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, that's a.
Well, the thing that kills me about a lot of this stuff is there's so many fascinating tools that do certain things, and some are good at little niches of things. Some, like Obsidian, are good at a lot of everything, but then they also have so much stuff under the hood, or even Mark Bernstein's product. You gotta spend some time and learn the product and the system.
Oh yeah.
To get the full value out of what's going on. But I'll see new things like, or man, you played around with Scrintle for a while.
Yep.
But the issue is you've got to find a way to export your notes from something and put them into the new thing. Because if you've been, I have a hypothesis set up with over 16,000 notes in it.
Right.
And to me, that's phenomenally valuable. But if I could put it into some Canvas-like screen to be able to organize and make sense out of some of it, or move it around, or do whatever, or throw it into something like Obsidian where I can create those wiki type links and do something with that, all the better. But the problem is your data is usually siloed in one tool, and none of the other there's a lot of them actually now that use Markdown as a kind of a default, but they don't make it easy for me to open up a new tool and say, use the data in this set of files and give me what your tool does working on that set.
Well,
That I get value out of it without having to so somebody says, is Morgan gonna like jump to some new tool? 9 times out of 10, no, they're not going to do that, because then it's all the extra work of taking everything they had before, moving it to the new thing, massaging it, the formats to make it work.
That said, providing you're not trying to move Obsidians back to, say, Evernote, because Obsidian's using pretty good, clean Markdown, and they are basically dumb text files on your drive, wherever you put your drive. You get something coming along like Logseek. You just point them at the same directory, and it goes, "Oh, I recognise this," and uploads 60,000 Obsidian notes in like half an hour. Job done. I mean, it took me over 2 weeks to do 40,000 plus from Evernote into Markdown, and in such a way that I've got a dumb vault that I don't use that much in Obsidian, that is Obsidian reading. And I don't let it go because I'm still moving. I don't let it go there for very long because it'll sit there and try to index and do all the clever shit that Obsidian does. I want to have them there ready such that when I find them in Evernote, I can then, I find them in Joplin because Evernote put the price up, and I wondered a bit more about what's happening there. So
I thought they were done.
No, Evernote is an internal proprietary file type that you can easily export to Joplin. But now also, because it's become more common, people have now got little side tools like Chris said. There are tools that do one thing and one thing only, and very well.
I see.
Some of those tools you might only need for one task that might take you a couple of months, but you might never need to do again. There's a really couple of good tools that will say, give us your export from Evernote as a EXEN file, which is the Evernote export file, and we'll just chuck it all into Markdown.
Yeah. I guess I haven't been paying close attention, but I thought I gathered from Nick Milo that it was all over for Evernote, and it was like time to jump into the lifeboats.
They have kind of sold, and a couple months back they fired all of their US staff. And essentially they retrenched to Europe.
Nice.
But they also doubled their price, didn't they?
Yeah.
They're essentially just making moves to make themselves more financially sustainable in a world where there are a lot of free tools that do what they're doing for a paid price. But I'm still waiting for a bunch of the big, OneNote, you can use wiki links and it'll create an empty file that's not an empty file, but you can double click on it and then add stuff. But it's not doing the cross-linking. And so I'm still waiting for some of the big, Evernote
can't do that either.
Like add those functionalities.
Well, Readwise is a good intermediary. I didn't realize. I just started using Readwise maybe 5-6 months ago, and once I've got all my notes from 200 books in Obsidian.
Yeah,
that was
Readwise. The sweeping from Readwise, from Kindle, and it'll pull your hypothesis in as well. So.
Yeah, see, you're right. I wish I would have kept up with hypothesis because, that wasn't the system. Does Readwise cross-link through Evernote too? I forget it.
No, it will export to Evernote, but it won't take out of Evernote.
Yeah, see, you want something that moves them across, because you're right, having them in Markdown, say once they're in Obsidian, whatever they were originally and however they got there, it's whatever, it's irrelevant.
It's irrelevant. Yeah. I mean, the my next big step is to finalize the integration between Zotero and Obsidian. But then allows me, therefore, to do I want to use Logseed for the elements of journaling, task management, because Logseed's a little bit better at that than Obsidian is with one or two plugins, or do I just carry on? But the Readwise has got a couple of free competitors as well, but they're rather like going back to what Chris said, is that they do certain things, but they don't necessarily do everything. So you end up with needing 3 or 4 equivalents, clones of Readwise to be able to export from everywhere. But it's also then which one's more important and which one's more flexible. And at the moment, virtually everything that Readwise can do, it seems that Zotero in its current incarnation, version 6 point something, does for free and better. Particularly if you want it from with all the extra things that Zotero does, as in it goes away and finds all the citation information to you, whereas Readwise says, "What the fuck's a citation?"
Yeah, I use Zotero, but I don't link it to Obsidian really. I have linked it to Research Rabbit, but I haven't used Research Rabbit in the last few months.
Yeah, I haven't either.
No.
Oh, while we're on tools and stuff and shifts and changes with things like Evernote, I will drop in here, and I'm not sure because I haven't gotten the full scuttlebutt just yet, but should have it shortly. While I was on vacation and have kind of been away a chunk of this week as well, but Hypothesis went from a staff of 35 to my counting down to about 19 in the last 2 weeks here. Most of what they've lost are their customer service and help experts, and maybe 1 or 2 kind of lower mid-level programmer developers. But they seemed, and then I was on one call this week it was an update of here's the new stuff that we've got coming up, or new functionality, almost all of which is LMS integrated things.
Yeah, I didn't attend that because
but I heard on that call, I heard a word about 30 times in the half an hour that they usually schedule them for an hour. This happened to end at about 30 minutes. But I heard a word that I have heretofore almost never heard a Hypothesis employee utter, and that is the word customer. Customer.
There you go.
From start to finish on that conference call.
That's a clue.
And I slipped into they were kind of pre-screening questions in their Zoom meeting, but I very pointedly said, I know there have been some big change, and I asked it anonymously to see what the response would be. I know there have been a big shakeup at Hypothesis in the last couple of weeks. What does this mean for the product going forward? They answered every question I saw in the chat, except for that one, which apparently was not made public to the rest of the chat room, and was just totally ignored. So I'm not sure what this means. I know a year or so ago, they got a $15 million infusion from some outside money. And I presume they're going to go out and hire 5 developers and triple their staff, which they not only didn't do, but now they're kind of stepping back and they seem to be doubling down onto how do we productize this to make it a sustainable company going forward, which I'm all for.
Yeah.
And I'd be thrilled to death to give them $10 a month, for the functionality, especially if they were to give me, better integration with data and you name it.
Yeah. No, I agree.
That's something at least to put in your hat and think about where that may or may not be going. But it's also underlines the fact of, it's a company that has your data.
Right.
And if you either don't export it or don't watch it and take care of it, it may disappear overnight.
Yeah.
And that was actually an issue. I was always curious about what Mike, and Mike never had at Research Rabbit, never really had a complete answer about what are you going to do with all these records of all these searches and all these connections and all these choices that people have made about what to add in to, your libraries and stuff. Because that seemed like that
with
a huge
with research. Well, with Research Rabbit, and assuming you're not making comments on anything other than where you're at in the process of, I've got the PDF for this one, or I haven't read it yet, or whatever. And sort of with Research Rabbit, I've used that much more as a Google search equivalent, rather than say like Zotero, where I've got something and I need to say something. And because and you also, of course, with Zotero, they make their money by selling you server space, but you can flip how Zotero works such that on the Zotero server is only the metadata. And the documents reside on your drive.
Right.
And that's where the comments are. So your searching is slightly slower, but it means your 300 megabytes of metadata space is huge relative to when I did a check the other day, and I think on what actually on the laptop, not even on the solid, portable hard drives with the old stuff. I've got something like, so it was like 320 gigabytes of PDFs.
Yep.
And it's like, okay, how many of those got the word climate in? And it was like 100 gigabytes.
Sure.
Yep. And, it's, you've only got to go grab a couple of IPC reports and you grow quite fast.
Yes. Yep.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay. So it's noon here. So it must be like 9 o'clock where you are, Tim.
3 minutes past, yeah.
Yep. All right. So we should probably call it. So thank you. This was interesting. I will use that. And Chris, I did post a link to that doc drop, if that's okay with you, in the
Hypothesis owns that domain, not me. So
it's yep. So they
I
can
don't know where it came from. I just saw it one day and started annotating there, and
there you go. So they can deal with the copyright issue. It's fair use. It's fair use.
Actually, well, I don't think it's actually owned by Hypothesis. I think it's a third-party domain that happens to be owned by the CEO of Hypothesis.
Oh, perfectly. So
that's my understanding. It's a separate tool that's not corporately associated, but happens to just work. So
nice. All right. Okay, cool. Well, thanks. And I'll start working on that and see you next week.
Thanks.
Okay, have fun.
Thanks, Pat, for recommending the book.